Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations. You no doubt have heard about the proposed changes to Notre Dame by now. If not, I have the story for you today, with some details that are being conveniently left out by most of the Catholic reporting, emphasis on Catholic, and the details don't make the story any better. In fact, they make it all the worse. So happy and blessed Advent, everyone, because I have the kind of story for you today that really illustrates why we should engage in fasting and penance for the salvation of our clergy and their souls. Let's dive into the story. But first, I wanted to thank the patrons and channel members for their continued support of the work of this channel. By contributing $1 a month to the work of this channel, they help keep the news, analysis, and historic content coming, so a big thanks to them. If you want to become a patron of the channel, there are links to Patreon and Subscribestar in the description box below, or you can click the Join button option on your screen. Thanks, and let's get to the story. The proposed renovations, or Wreckovations, are getting described by the media as a theme park for the secular values of the world. Is that what's likely to happen? We had this described this way by the Telegraph, quote, "Under new plans, confessional boxes, altars, and glass sculptures will be scrapped for trendy art murals with sound and lighting effects creating emotional spaces. A discovery trail will lead visitors through various chapels with an emphasis on Africa and Asia, and scripture will be beamed onto the walls in various languages, including Mandarin. One of the sanctuaries will even be dedicated to the environment." Maurice Culot, an award-winning Paris-based architect, told the Telegraph, "It's as if Disney were entering Notre Dame. What they're proposing to do to Notre Dame would never be done to Westminster Abbey or St. Peter's in Rome. It's a kind of theme park and very childish and trivial given the grandeur of the place." End quote. In other words, the proposal is that the cathedral is to be converted into the values of the universal Church of Man. That's just from the description of the proposed project. The reporting makes it sound like the proposal is coming from the state or some secular sort of architectural authority, but here's the thing, it's not. The proposals come from a priest who has clearly lost sight of what a cathedral is for. That is at the heart of the story. What is a cathedral for? A cathedral is a house of God with important symbolic purposes for the laity and the church in a particular region. To give you a basic Catholic refresher, their website of the Basilica of St. Mary in Virginia gives us this, quote, "A cathedral is the home church for the bishop or archbishop of a diocese. It takes its names from the bishop's chair, called a cathedra in Latin. The cathedra represents the position and authority of the bishop, the place where he resides in the territory of his jurisdiction. The bishop is the pastor of his cathedral parish and appoints a rector to manage its spiritual and temporal affairs. It is the main church of a diocese and functions as a parish church within itself." End quote. A cathedral has a purpose, and at the heart of the Notre Dame story is a question about what the purpose of Notre Dame should be. An article from Pillar Catholic sums up the dilemma nicely. What is the cathedral in Paris for? Quote, "Behind a hot-take debate about aesthetics and cultural heritage is a more fundamental question about Notre Dame, or any cathedral for that matter, and what it's actually for. And amid widespread institutional disaffiliation in countries where Christianity was once a powerful cultural force, that question has relevance well beyond the banks of the River Seine. A set of plans for renovations to the cathedral's interior was first reported by the Daily Telegraph over the weekend. It apparently includes the removal of many of the cathedral's confessionals and the transformation of historic side altars into spaces focused on quote-unquote dialogue between traditional art and modern installations. Plans reportedly also include installations themed to reflect socio-political issues, including the environment and the projection of scriptural verses onto cathedral walls in different languages." End quote. For those who may be wondering, why is the church in France permitting this? For two reasons, really. One, the church in France is powerless to stop the state from doing it. The issue goes back to an act by the government passed in 1905 that is often called the Law of 1905, that put a concrete barrier between church and state in that country. It nationalized, meaning put the government as owner, of all church buildings built before 1905 in that country, which obviously includes Notre Dame Cathedral. The cathedral, in plainest possible language, is the property of the government, not the property of the church. The hierarchy of bishops in Rome or France are really powerless to do anything about this ultimate modernist Wreckovation. Secondly, you may have heard recently about the troubles the church has had in France with baseless claims being made that there are a whole host of Ted McCarrick-style priests in that country. And I say baseless because, while the media report the story with bated breath, what really happened is this. French authorities opened a telephone hotline where anonymous claims about Ted McCarrick issues with the clergy could be reported, with no time limit either, meaning they could report issues going back 75 years if they wanted to. And many, many people called and were not required to furnish any proof whatsoever, meaning some real calls about true events absolutely came in, let's not dispute that, but also a lot of calls came in from sources who are opposed to the church and want to harm it in any way they can, including by lying about things that should never be lied about under any circumstances. This is why I don't trust any claims by any secular authority on that topic anymore, and why every claim should be investigated by Catholics who possess a true fear of God. But that issue in France has hamstrung the church more than anything, and the timing is perfect so that a design by a secular thinking priest that serves the purposes of the French state can be used to turn Notre Dame into a secular cathedral. Without question, the priest here is a modernist, for only a modernist would think defacing the cathedral like this is a good thing. And you can tell that the priest in question is a modernist because of what he says here. But back to the Pillar article, quote, "The priest responsible for the plans has pushed back and offered a rationale for the redesign. He has insisted the aim is to preserve the cathedral's focus on divine liturgy while embracing the catechetical potential offered by Notre Dame's status as a global tourist attraction." While the priest has stressed that his institute's proposals had the full support of Paris's Archbishop Michael Apauti, the building itself is the property of the state, and Drouin's plans will have to pass the muster at the government's National Heritage and Architecture Commission next week. The commission has, at least in relation to the cathedral's exterior, indicated in the past that it prefers a just-as-it-was approach to the restoration of the World Heritage Site. Many outraged at the prospect of modern art and mood music within the church are hoping the government's commission will veto the plans. Ironically, they are now looking to the secular state to forestall the church's own proposals for the cathedral's interior. End quote. In other words, this came from the church in France. Yeah, modernism is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Now, the phrase World Heritage Site is at the crux of the problem, actually. World Heritage Sites are tourist attractions, meaning there's money here, lots of it. They are recognized for their historic and cultural importance and are preserved to protect important aspects of culture. But let's be very honest here, they're economic drivers as well. In fact, that's actually one of the main purposes of the World Heritage Site designation. And Notre Dame is possibly one of the biggest tourist attractions in the world. This is about money. And the galling thing about this is that the proposal is coming from a priest who works for a disgraced archbishop. They should be the ones defending the cathedral against any desires to modernize it and make it attractive to the values and forces of the world, not working to help make it secular. But thus is the nature of modernism. Father Chad Ripperger had an essay on the purpose of art, beauty in the church, and he sums up the problem here beautifully. Quote, "It appears as if some members of the church have no aesthetic sense, or very little aesthetic sense, because they are building churches which are ugly, and they are putting statuary in the churches which are equally hideous. We build churches which do not draw people to contemplation, and then we wonder why mental prayer has collapsed among the laity. We put in statues that are unrecognizable, and we wonder why the cultus of saints has imploded. The fact is that people are moved by what comes into the senses. If we present people with statues that lack clarity and proportion and symmetry, and then we wonder why people do not go up to the altar rail and pray before the statue, we only have ourselves to blame." End quote. A cathedral is more than a church. It is a center for Catholic art and culture. What this priest's proposal does is turn the building into a contemplative center for the secular. The art in a cathedral as an art center is supposed to help turn our minds in a contemplative manner towards the divine. It's supposed to help you deepen your faith. But what he has done here has stripped the altars of the faith and turned it into a universal church of man in a literal sense. And that proposal comes from a Catholic priest, not from the secular authorities. This is the end result of modernism, and now that fate of Notre Dame resides in the hands of secular authorities, which is oddly and perfectly acceptable for the modernist mind. Will the State Commission keep its just-as-it-was policy? Perhaps, but it's worth noting here that Archbishop Michael Apauti has submitted his resignation to Francis over the whole McCarrick mess in France. This mess is convoluted because, on the one hand, the French state may change its mind due to the bad press the church is getting in France at this time. On the other, it may take a somewhat smarter approach and preserve the World Heritage Site because it is a World Heritage Site, but not because it's a Catholic cathedral. And that's kind of a huge problem in itself because the designation of something or someplace being a World Heritage Site comes from UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, whose many other works in the area of culturally important areas always focuses heavily on economic benefits of tourism. In other words, any move to make Notre Dame more attractive to tourists will actually be in keeping with at least some of the biggest values of the parent organization of the World Heritage Site program. This is a complicated issue, not because the values at the core of it are all that complicated, but because you have on one side of the issue clergy who are promoting modernism and the values of the world and doing the work of their father below, and on the other hand, you have an economic development organization who is tasked with preserving a balance between culture and economic development. And that group has a history of siding with economic development in many cases. This is made all the more complicated by conveniently timed McCarrick messes in France that will certainly have some influence in the debate, even if it's not overt. Thankfully, we'll know how this plays out in a week, so we won't have to wait long. But please pray that the preservation of the site as a Catholic site happens, and that this doesn't get turned into some sort of secular Disneyland. The institutional church has dropped the ball here, so your prayers are needed. What did you think of this? Does knowing a priest and his bishop are at the heart of this story make it any clearer? Let me know in the comments, please, and like and subscribe if you haven't. It does really help. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.